Welcome to the Meleti, our study of Mark's Gospel. We mentioned before that Mark's Gospel is read on the Sundays during Great Lent. I think there's one or two Sundays, one when John is read and another when Luke is read, but for the most part they're all from Mark's Gospel. And Mark is very concise. You know, he tells the stories very directly and simply, and perhaps that's why they're used during Great Lent. It's sort of a summary of everything that other people are saying, in a way. But Mark had traveled at least some distance with Apostle Peter. They were in Antioch together, I gather after, we're not told in Scripture where Peter went after he was out of prison and he had to go away. But we know that he was in Antioch, and near Antioch there's a cave called the Cave of St. Peter, where there's a church. And that Peter had stayed there after he'd gotten out of prison, perhaps. But in any case, Mark was also with him in Alexandria in Egypt. And that's why the Egyptian, the Coptic people call their liturgy the Liturgy of St. Mark. It's similar to ours, but as some of you might know, the Coptic liturgy is much longer. But in general, what we understand is that Mark heard all the details from Apostle Peter, and what he's doing is recording what Apostle Peter was telling him about the life of Christ in the time of the apostles. So in a way it's kind of Peter's story as well in it. Mark isn't as concerned about the proper chronology as about telling the story in a way that, first of all, he wants to show us what John the Baptist's ministry actually was about. And then he goes into what Christ's ministry was actually about. And then we see the story just unfolds in front of us. And some of the other apostles were a little, especially the ones who were with Christ, a little more detailed about the chronology. When did these things happen, in what order? And Mark's not too concerned with that. That isn't his point. And he's just, again, writing down basically what Apostle Peter told him about it. So that's why, when we sometimes see the differences in the Gospels, this is one of the reasons. Luke is writing some details in the Acts. And Luke also wrote the Gospel. But Luke wasn't present, except toward the very last, with Christ. And so when he starts to write his story, he does a lot of research. He asks a lot of questions of a lot of people. Even the Theotokos herself, he just talked with her. So Luke's is kind of researched carefully. And perhaps that's why we get a lot more detail. But we also notice that in Luke's Gospel and the Acts of the Apostles, that we know that Luke was a physician. And when one studies it carefully in Greek, of course, I mean, I haven't been able to, but there's a lot of medical diction in Luke's writings, the sort of way that a doctor would have written. And Luke is also very interested in the lives of the women around him at the time. He's very sympathetic to the women and tells some of the stories through the women's eyes in it. Mark gives us some detail about life in Galilee at the time, life in Judea. And we can get insights into the way people lived and the way they functioned through Mark. So if we read it just from that point of view alone, we get a lot of information. I know people sometimes raise the question in the story of the Gadarene swine. Well, Jews, of course, wouldn't generally have a herd of swine. But Gadara wasn't just Jewish, a lot of Greeks there. But also they were responsible for feeding the Roman army. And raising swine was part of it because the Roman army consumed a lot. And so a lot of people who wouldn't normally have swine herds did because they sold it. They sold the meat to the Roman army that was around. And so Mark gives us a different kind of shade about the stories he tells us. Just because he makes little observations perhaps even without realizing it or not intending to, about the life of people of everyday life. But the one thing that keeps coming through, and I should try to make the point again, we discussed it earlier, there are two schools of Pharisees. And the earthly family of Christ were in all likelihood Pharisees. I mean, we're almost certain that they were. But the two schools of Pharisees, one were what you call very rigid and kind of fundamentalist in a way. And they're the ones who always worried about the small traditions that happened. And you know, we talk about traditions. We know sacred tradition, this is something special. But we often look at traditions, and some of the traditions that people hold, and they defend them because they're traditions, but some of them are very destructive, and some of them should be done away with. You know, there's nothing wrong with the Pharisees, and in this section of Mark, Gospel, the Pharisees are complaining because Christ's disciples eat without washing their hands. Now, the Pharisees wouldn't, when they went to the market, they'd come home, and they would, actually the scripture says, sprinkle their hands. So they would ritually sprinkle their hands. And of course, nothing was wrong with washing of cups and plates either. But somehow when you make it, turn it into a religious fetish of some kind, then it becomes a little bit of a problem. And what Christ is discussing in this section of Mark's Gospel is how they're very fussy about traditions, but human traditions, but don't pay really that much attention to the proper law. And I think we'll start with chapter 6 is where we had been now. But, you know, Christ has healed Jairus' daughter, actually raised her from the dead, and ordered them to give her something to eat. And the miracle of the loaves and the fishes has taken place. And yet people, some people still don't want to believe. They want this to be something else. So the parable that Christ told today, which from Matthew's Gospel, the one we had in the reading today, about the master of the vineyard sending his servants, and instead of rendering the fruits that were due to the master, they killed the servants. And Christ, of course, is referring to the prophets and even to himself. He says, even if the master of the vineyard sends the son, they'll kill the son and say, we'll seize his inheritance. So these are the kind of Pharisees that he's facing against, and they're always trying to find some small, simplistic thing to complain about. And most of the time we can see that they're very petty. And I don't know if you know what petulance means, but petulance is when a child can't get their way, so they throw a fit. Well, adults do the same thing, then it's real petulance. Adults don't get their way, so they throw a fit. I don't, you know the story of Ahab in the vineyard from the Old Testament. There was a vineyard growing next to Ahab's palace, and Ahab wanted this vineyard, but it was owned, handed down from generation to generation by a family, and not a weak family at that. Well, Ahab wanted to buy the vineyard, and the owner wouldn't sell it to him. So Ahab, very petulant, he took to his bed, and he wouldn't eat or drink, and he wouldn't get out of bed. It might sound like a 6 or 7 year old child, but anyway, that was Ahab. He was cruel, he was wicked, and his cruelty and wicked were just petulant. If he didn't get his way, he would do something evil to somebody. His wife was cut from a different wool, though, and she was quite capable of getting rid of the neighbor and getting the vineyard into the house. But Ahab was kind of a petulant person. Now we're going to a little bit read about the matter of John the Baptist. Is really our next episode. You know, John the Baptist is preaching in it's a part of Galilee, but it's cut off from Galilee and it's down closer to Judea. It's a little, like a little province with somebody else's territory in between it. And John is gathered quite a substantial following. And Herod is actually something of a follower of John. He has a great reverence for John as a prophet. And he's trying to listen to his words and trying to learn something, even though very often he's confused by what John's saying. Nevertheless, he has this kind of respect and reverence for him. He's a little bit like Ahab here, because I think we may have discussed before, but I think we should discuss it again, what the real problems were with Herod wanting to marry Herodias, his brother's wife. In the first place, Herodias was Philip's half-sister, so he shouldn't have been married to her in the first place. But she was also Herod's half-sister. And in any case, they fell in love, and they were how to get Philip to divorce her so he could marry her. But the matter was a little complicated because the kingdom of Nabatea was still semi-independent of Rome and a very strong kingdom with a fairly strong army. Herod had, just a little earlier, the old capital of Galilee was a place called Sepphoris. And there had been a battle between Galilee and Nabatea before, and King Aretas of Nabatea had come and burned the city to the ground. You know, Herod was building a new capital naturally named after himself, but this was the old capital. And so there was a treaty to end this war. Herod married the daughter of King Aretas. We never learned her name, but anyway, she was married to Herod. And this was a treaty marriage. Now, the daughter of King Aretas was a little bit nervous about this love affair with Herod and Herodias, because in order to marry Herodias, Herod would have to get rid of her some way. So she was afraid she might meet with some kind of accident. You know, be just killed off somewhere, which would look like an accident or an illness. So in the middle of the night, she fled, went down to the part where John the Baptist was baptizing, and then proceeded on back to her father's capital of Petra. Now, when John is preaching about the problems of Herod marrying Herodias, he also has in mind the possibility that it could cause another war, because you know, Nabatea is still a powerful force. And in fact, Aretas was all set to go march on Galilee, perhaps burn the new capital, but the Romans intervened and stopped him. Otherwise, there would have been another war. And that's part of what John the Baptist's consideration was, that you're going to cause a war over this and a lot of people will die, and what for? You're not supposed to be married to your sister anyway, even if she's only half-sister. Well, Herod doesn't want to do anything bad to John because, again, he considers him to be a prophet. He's a little bit afraid of him. But Herodias is another story. So where Herod is unable to silence John, even though he puts him in prison, he still can't silence him. Herodias contrives with her daughter to have John beheaded. I mean, everybody knows the story. We don't have to see it. But it does remind me of Ahab and Jezebel, because when Ahab was a little bit afraid of one of the prophets, Jezebel made up the difference. She wasn't afraid of anybody. And she would bring about the evil through Ahab. And now here Herodias is determined to have what she wants. This is also a case of petulance. You don't get what you want, so you do something sometimes evil in response to not getting what you want. And this is what Herodias does now, and arranges the death of John the Baptist. And although Herod really was still afraid of John, but it happens. So you have a weak-willed person like Herod, and a weak-willed person like Ahab, but both of them can do some really wicked, evil things. And they're both married to women who have no trouble whatsoever doing something really, really bad. And that shapes the men also somewhat. Jezebel, you know, what was from outside of Israel, and she brought with her the pagan worship of Baal into the kingdom. And we see then that Herod built some temples for Baal, and also what they call the sacred groves. This is under Jezebel's influence because at root, even though he's wicked, he's still a weak person. And part of his wickedness might have been to make up for his being weak. But I want to talk a little bit about evil because of the story of John the Baptist and how it was arranged for him to be killed. Because, you know, we have thoughts about evil, but we can't really define them. Because evil isn't a thing and it isn't a person. We refer to Satan as the evil one, not because evil is Satan, but because he is the one who completely evil, giving himself over totally to evil. But even with Satan, part of his evil is manifested, motivated by his own weakness, and by the fact that he didn't get his way. If you remember the story about the fall of Satan from heaven, it was because he didn't get his way. So it was petulant. Now, evil is very often, there are two words that I'm going to use about evil, and one is banal, and the other one is petulant. Now, banal is something that's, it seems kind of insignificant. It's something that is sort of too commonplace or too much a part of the world, and it doesn't have any unique qualities that should make it stand out. Now, a lot of evil people are really quite banal, and those are the ones who are bureaucrats, who carry out the will of somebody else. And they have no trouble whatsoever carrying out evil because they've been directed to by a bureaucrat or by a higher up. And so they make evil too common. And the other thing is that a lot of evil comes from petulance. And that is a person who doesn't have a proper conscience. If they don't get their way, they want revenge for not getting their way. And the strange thing is that a lot of evil is on the same plane as a child when you refuse to give them ice cream and they start screaming and stamping their feet. But it's very similar because there's a certain infantile quality to evil. And a kind of infantile mentality to it. And in both the cases we've been talking about, Herodias and Jezebel, they have no qualms about going after what they want. And they won't take no for an answer because they're very determined. But the two men they're married to have a certain weak quality to them. And ultimately, what provokes them to carry out some kind of evil is the fact that they're really just angry because they didn't get their way. So their power was challenged. And so much of evil is actually done on that basis. That when we see it done around us in politics or in the world, like I was had a long discussion Friday with a doctor who's Muslim from Pakistan. And we're talking about the terrorism in Pakistan and also the ISIS, you know, the new caliphate as they're calling it. Mm-hmm. And I said, well, you know, I read enough of Islamic philosophers and poets, and in fact the Quran too. And there's no way they can justify what they're doing there from any tradition, actual tradition in Islam. So it has nothing really to do with what is actually in the book. It has to do with the fact that they have their own interpretation of it and they want to force that on everybody else. And if they can't have their way, they're going to do something extremely violent. And a lot of people become involved in the violence because they find it exciting. Particularly young men will go and volunteer and become involved in it. And in a way, the evil that they're doing there is a kind of petulance. If you stop to think about it, if you don't start to believe the way we want you to believe, then we're going to chop your head off. I mean, that's a hideous thing, but at the root of it, it's just petulant. It's just, you know, I want my way and I'm going to get my way, and if you don't give me my way, I'm going to kill you. If you stop to think, though, how shallow evil really is, for all of the enormous destruction and pain and suffering that it causes. And this is the case with John Baptist. I think the important things are to realize that John's concerned not just about this legal matter of Herodias and Herod, but he's also concerned about the possibility of this war. And that's something that he wants. He's close to Meleti, where he's baptizing. And in fact, he started out at Bethel on the other side of the Jordan River, which is actually the province next to Meleti. And so this is a whole other aspect of it. And I think that realizing that Herod's not essentially an evil person, but he gets involved in something evil because somebody doesn't get their way. And it's intolerable for somebody with the mentality of Herodias not to get her way. So she leads her husband into the evil, just as Jezebel did with Ahab, doesn't it? So this is, maybe it's, I want to see if there are any questions before we go on, because this comes to a lot to digest, I think, a lot to think about. So does anybody have any questions about this? I mean, is it understood what we're saying? You know, you got somebody, well, take somebody like Stalin or Hitler. We see them as the evil person, but they've got all these bureaucrats under them and do whatever they're commanded to do. Now they know that it's evil, but it's just bureaucratic evil. You just carry it out like paperwork, like shifting papers around. And you're sentencing people to death, and to a horrible death at that. But I mean, you're just shuffling papers, isn't it? So it's very banal. This is what banality of evil is. It's sort of, well, I'm a bureaucrat. I'm supposed to get rid of these people. I collect all their names. I collect their papers, and then I put the papers in this basket, and that means you're going to go be killed. But that's they don't even, you know, not to think about it, have a conscience about it, because after all, I'm a bureaucrat, and this is what I do. So evil can become really that banal. And some of those people do worse than any person who's really visibly, openly evil. It's just a matter of indifference of what happens to people's lives in it. And that's, to me, one of the great tragedies of all. So, after John the Baptist is beheaded, his disciples don't really know terribly what to do, so they gather around Jesus and now to be led. So, let's see. The apostles gathered themselves together around Jesus and told him all these things that had happened, both what they had done and what they taught. And he said to them, "Come apart for a while and rest." So they're going apart to rest. Actually, they hadn't even had time to eat, as I recall. And immediately, when they get to the destination where they're supposed to rest and have a little peace, they're surrounded by a huge crowd that will come to swallow them. And instead of saying, well, let's push on to another place, as exhausted as they were, they started to minister to this whole crowd, because there was no thought for themselves, and Christ took no thought for himself. But immediately he begins to teach. And then they become worried or concerned about how they're going to feed this huge crowd. And if you remember when we were discussing earlier from one of the other Gospels about the feeding of the multitude in the wilderness, how Christ takes the bread and breaks it and the fish, and it's passed out to everyone. And afterwards, he tells them to gather all the crumbs so that not even one little crumb remains on the ground. All the crumbs have to be gathered up. And really, the revelation in that is that he's the God who gave the manna to the multitude in the wilderness in the first place. And you had to collect all the manna that evening. It all had to be picked up before sunset, before you quit. And these two are tied together, so that Christ is revealing to us he's the one who also miraculously gave bread in the wilderness to the Hebrews when they were coming up out of Egypt. And that is a very important revelation in it. That's what our 5 and 2 ministry's named. Didn't you see the interview I did with Ward Draper on our YouTube channel about the 5 and 2 ministry in Abbotsford? I think it's worth watching. I like the way Ward expresses things and how I like the way he looks at the whole picture in it. Anyway, then the Pharisees come together, and certain of the scribes who came up from Jerusalem just to see what was going on with Jesus. And they saw some of the disciples eat bread without washing their hands, and they found fault with it. Because the Pharisees and all the Jews except they wash their hands, they don't eat because of the traditions of the elders. And when they come from the market, except they wash, they don't eat. And many other things, such as washing of cups and plates and pots and vessels and tables. Now, all those things obviously are something that's good to be done, and we do the same thing. But when somebody doesn't do it, we don't start condemning them as if they were sinners or apostates, or if they had become somehow evil or something. So the Pharisees complained to Jesus and asked, why don't your disciples walk in the tradition of the elders, but eat bread with unwashed hands? And he answered and said, well does Isaiah the prophet speak about you hypocrites, as it is written, the people honor me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. Now this is the part where they're complaining about people not washing their hands according to tradition. I mean, there's no law that says you have to wash your hands. It's probably a good tradition, but nevertheless. They're very fussy about it. And then Christ turns to them and says, well, look, the first law with promise says to honor your father and your mother. And you have an obligation to your father and your mother. But the tradition of the elders, the same people who gave us the tradition of washing our hands, is that if you say to your parents, it's korban. What that essentially means is that I'm not going to give you anything anymore, I'm not going to help you anymore, because any help I give, any money I give is going to be for God. You know, theoretically you'll put it in the temple treasury, not that anybody did. But all of a sudden you can just say this word, it's korban, and you no longer have to honor your father and your mother, you no longer have to help them, you no longer have to give any thought to them, but it completely violates the law. And I know that occasionally we come across some traditions that have come up in maybe a local Orthodox church, or even more broadly than that, and the tradition itself is actually contrary to the actual dogma or doctrine of the faith. But it's just a tradition of some kind. And we stumble across some of these things sometimes, and people are extremely fussy about them. Some of the Russians, for example, if when you're making the sign of the cross, you bow while you're making the sign of the cross, it's a great sin, maripakat, because you broke the cross. You bowed while you were making the cross, you broke the cross. And this is something they get very exercised about and very upset about. And yet, in Greece and most of Serbia, we bow while we make the cross all the time. But somehow this is something that's fixed. And it's, I think it's even sinful to look at those things. Because what are you doing looking at the way somebody else makes the sign of the cross anyway? So why are you paying attention to that anyway? And now you make up something that gives you a tool to condemn somebody with. You don't make the sign of the cross big enough. If your fingers aren't completely together when you make the cross, or you bow while you're making the cross. And among the Greeks, a married couple that don't have children are considered to be in sin. At the same time, having sexual relations, even to have children, is considered to be a sin. So you see what you get into, what kind of a corner you get painted into in it. You couldn't take communion in Greece at least at one time, if you're married and didn't have children. But that takes you back to the story of Joachim and Anna. Remember that Joachim was despised because he didn't have any children, and Anna would more or less hide herself because it was such a shame. She had to live in shame because he hadn't had children. But these are kind of traditions that are made up, and they don't have any roots or foundation in Scripture. And yet we try to sometimes enforce those things in the Orthodox Church. So it's all the same as the Pharisees saying, why do your apostles eat with unwashed hands? Meanwhile, I can say Korban and tell my parents to, go fly a kite, I'm not going to help you anymore. I can despise you or leave you out. But we have to watch for those things ourselves, because when we read the Scripture, we can't think of it just in terms of something historical or a long time ago, but something that is kind of ongoing, and we need to watch ourselves with it. You can probably think of any number of local traditions in the Romanian church or the Russian church or anything. In Imperial Russia, if you saw a priest when you set out first thing in the morning, if he was on the same side of the street as you, you quickly crossed the street to walk on the other side, because it was bad luck to encounter a priest first thing in the morning. And I read that when a priest would go to a simple people's home in Russia, because somebody was sick, they would stop at the door and put their feet together and hop over the threshold, because the people were watching. And if you put the right foot over the threshold first, the person was going to get well. If you put the left foot over the threshold first, the person was going to die. So the priest would actually stop and just hop over the threshold, so you couldn't make up anything about it. And if you were in Greek living in Cappadocia or that region that's now Turkey especially, you had to, if you met a black dog and it yawned, you're in danger. And if you yawned at the same time the black dog yawned, then a demon would jump down your throat from the black dog. Now presumably if it was a white dog or a red dog or something, that wouldn't be a problem. But if it was a black dog, it was a real problem. And some people become so worried and concerned about these things that they don't think about the greater things of the gospel, or what it's really all about. And this is kind of the point I think we want to arrive at with this matter of saying, well, you didn't wash your hands before you ate, this is a terrible sin, but I can just dump my parents and forget about them, and that's okay because I said it's Korban. So, and I think we'll probably stop there anyway on that part. So.